World War I was one of the worst catastrophes in human history, and everything about it shows the foolishness of the view that smart leaders can make wars turn out as intended, and that war can be a controlled, rational basis for progress. World War I marked the end of a glorious era, the most peaceful period in modern history. The last big European war had concluded a century earlier in 1815 when the French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte was defeated and banished. The Napoleonic Wars helped convince several generations that war was an evil to be avoided. Napoleon had established the first modern police state. He developed a spy network throughout Europe, and he had arranged to have enemies kidnapped and shot. Napoleon humiliated German-speaking people in several countries by forcing them to combine under French control. Napoleon threw out corrupt old tyrants, which local people surely appreciated, but in many cases they were replaced by Napoleon's relatives who became corrupt new tyrants. The consequences of the Napoleonic Wars were devastating as they played out decades later in Prussia and throughout Europe. The wars set back the economic life of much of Europe for a generation. They made men behave like beasts, and worse. The battles were bigger and much more bloody. The armies of the old regimes were of long service professional veterans, often lifers, obsessed with uniforms, pipe clay, polished brass, and their elaborate drill. The kings could not bear to lose them. Napoleon cut their hair short, entered the powdered wigs, supplied mass-produced uniforms, and spent the lives of his young drafted recruits as if they were loose change. His insistence that they live off the land did not work in subsistence economies like Spain and Russia, where if the soldier stole, the peasant starved. Throughout Europe, the standards of human conduct declined as men and women and their growing children learned to live brutally. The savagery was shocking. French corpses piled up in the mountain ravines. Drunk with fury against the priests who preached hatred, the French soldiers sacked the churches and carried away the holy objects. The village priests slaughtered the French who sought refuge among them. Farms were left burning like torches when the French had passed by. The wounded and ill were murdered as they were being taken from one place to another. The roads were strewn with naked corpses. The trees were weighed down with the bodies of men hanged. It was blind hate against hate. A nameless terror roamed the deserted countryside. Altogether, Napoleon's wars resulted in the deaths of some 2 million people. Undoubtedly, the memories of Napoleonic war horrors convinced many people that they should avoid war. In September 1814, 5 months after Napoleon's first abdication, European foreign ministers met at the Congress of Vienna to negotiate history's most comprehensive and successful peace treaty. Vivid memories of Napoleon's war horrors weren't the only reason why the 1800s were comparatively peaceful. This was a period when the intellectual movement known as classical liberalism was in its heyday. Classical liberals cherished individual liberty, toleration, and peace, and to achieve these things, they embraced constitutional limitations on government power. The slogan of the time was laissez-faire, which meant let it be. Classical liberals began to sweep away thousands of taxes, tariffs, restrictions, and special privileges that had kept people down. It was during the 1800s that Europe and the United States became the first civilization to abolish slavery on its own. Support for free trade and peace grew hand in hand. One of the most important thoughts of classical liberal economists like Adam Smith was that nations could become richer through trade rather than through war. Believers in free trade and limited government, not socialists and progressives, were enemies of imperialism and colonialism. Treaties were signed by European countries to open borders to travel and trade. Never before in European history had people been able to go about their daily business so freely. Classical liberal ideas prevailed through the 1860s in Western Europe, and military conflicts were few and limited. There was substantial separation between the economy and the state. Political borders were more open than they had been before, and if private businessmen in one country wanted to do a deal in another country, they could negotiate directly with the people there. They weren't discriminated against by regulations in the other country, so they didn't have any reason to be concerned about where the political borders happened to be. As long as government stayed out of business, competition among private businesses from different countries wasn't likely to have political consequences like war. Eventually, intellectuals in Europe began attacking laissez-faire and classical liberalism. These attacks came in the form of economic nationalism, where each country's government tried to protect domestic industry through high tariffs, and socialism, where the government itself becomes the owner and works to prevent any inequalities. Each country had its own version of these two attacks on economic freedom, but they all agreed that the government was the solution to problems already being solved by free trade. Otto von Bismarck, founder of modern Germany, did more than anyone else to begin turning the world away from the principles of laissez-faire, free trade, and peace. He believed that socialist ideas could help expand government's power to strike at real or imagined enemies. He sped up trends that exploded into World War I. Apparently, in just a few decades, the horrors of the Napoleonic Wars had been forgotten, and more people began to dream about imperial glory. Britain had lost its American colonies, but developed trading posts in India, and after 1870, people wanted more. Britain's Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli promoted imperialism by spending more money on armaments. He got involved in the war between Russia and Turkey, had British forces invade South Africa and Afghanistan, claimed about 200 Pacific islands, and acquired controlling interest over the Suez Canal, a move which afforded more secure access to British India, but became an 80-year occupation of Egypt. Disraeli flattered Queen Victoria by naming her Empress of India, and she cherished the thought that the sun never set on the British Empire. French leaders warned that if their country didn't gain imperial territory while it was still available, it would become a second or third-rate power. In 1881, France seized territory in Africa and East Asia. Socialists blamed imperialism on capitalism. Yet conquerors had pillaged the earth for centuries before anyone ever heard of free markets. Moreover, it was very expensive to rule colonies, and most of the trade that resulted was between the rich countries themselves and not the colonies. Imperialism, therefore, was a competition for power and prestige, not wealth. It did not fit the capitalist model for successful economies.